Now, imagine you're a restaurant manager, working tirelessly to keep everything perfect, when suddenly a seemingly unassuming guest walks in. What happens when you mistake him for just another ordinary diner? Well, let's just say the person you kick out might not be who you think. Stick around till the end to find out how one bad decision changes everything, and trust me, you won't believe who he really was. Watch till the end because this twist will blow your mind. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to stay updated with all our latest content. It was a busy night at La Belle Époque, a high-end French restaurant that prided itself on exclusivity. The ambience was effortlessly sophisticated. White linen tablecloths on every table, crystal chandeliers casting soft light over the polished wood floors, and the soothing sounds of a jazz quartet drifting through the air. The waitstaff moved between the tables with practiced grace, anticipating every need before it was spoken. The room buzzed with quiet chatter, punctuated by the clink of fine china and the occasional pop of a champagne cork. The night was in full swing when the door creaked open, and in walked Clint Eastwood, unassuming and calm, wearing nothing more than a simple leather jacket and a pair of well-worn jeans. His weathered face, with its familiar craggy features, was mostly unnoticed by the crowd, too absorbed in their wine glasses and conversations to recognize the man who had just stepped in. To the casual observer, Clint blended into the background like any other guest, but there was something undeniably distinct about him, a presence that only those who had the eyes to see would notice. As Clint stepped inside, the host, a young man named Alex, offered him a polite but cursory greeting. The host, with his perfectly pressed suit and impeccable smile, led Clint to a table by the window, where the view of the city's glowing skyline would provide a tranquil backdrop to his meal. He didn't know it yet, but Clint was about to be the center of a drama he hadn't asked for. Clint settled into his seat with the kind of ease only someone who had lived through 1,000 situations like this could possess. He scanned the menu, the pages illuminated by the soft glow of the candle at his table. His expression was serene, detached even, as if he were just another customer looking for a peaceful meal away from the spotlight. He wasn't here to make a scene. In fact, he hadn't even thought about his place in the room, he just wanted to eat. Meanwhile, in the back of the restaurant, Jonathan, the manager, was having a very different experience. He paced back and forth in his office, the stress of the evening weighing heavily on him. He was juggling multiple complaints: a steak cooked incorrectly, a reservation mix-up that led to an unhappy couple being seated at a smaller table than they'd expected, and a guest who was more than vocal about his dissatisfaction with the wine list. To Jonathan, these were not just small annoyances, they were threats to the restaurant's reputation. In the midst of this whirlwind, Jonathan looked up and caught sight of Clint seated at his table by the window. He paused. Something about the man's casual attire, no suit, no tie, no polished look, didn't sit right with him. His eyes flicked to the other tables, well-dressed men in suits, women in elegant dresses, perfectly in line with the image La Belle Époque cultivated. Then back to Clint, who, despite his unmistakable age and quiet demeanor, appeared far too ordinary. Jonathan furrowed his brow. Was this guy just another regular trying to blend in, or had he slipped in thinking this place was something less refined? He felt a pang of irritation, like something was just off about the whole situation, but it wasn't clear why. The more he stared, the more unsettled he became. Shaking his head, Jonathan turned back to his growing list of problems. He was used to handling high-maintenance customers, but Clint Eastwood? Something about this didn't feel like just another night at the restaurant. Jonathan's frustration was mounting with every passing minute. The night had already been a challenge, an off-ordered appetizer here, an unhappy customer there, but now there was Clint Eastwood. Or rather, there was a man who looked like Clint Eastwood sitting at a table in his restaurant, wearing a leather jacket and jeans as if he were out on a casual stroll instead of dining at one of the city's most exclusive spots. Jonathan's mind raced. This restaurant needed to maintain a certain image, a cultivated aura of elegance that made every patron feel like they were part of something special. The last thing he needed was to risk the pristine reputation of La Belle Époque over one guest who seemed out of place. He'd spent years working his way up from dishwasher to manager, proving himself at every level, navigating endless challenges. Now, as manager, he had the power to decide who belonged and who didn't. He wasn't about to let some too-casual diner ruin everything he had worked so hard to build. His eyes flicked nervously around the dining room again. The other patrons were in their element. Men in crisp suits, women in elegant gowns, their laughter light and easy, their conversations laced with the knowledge that they were in a special place. Meanwhile, Clint was sitting there, completely at ease, leaning back in his chair like he didn't have a care in the world. He had a peaceful air about him, as if he didn't understand that the stakes here were high. A few minutes passed, but the tension in Jonathan's chest grew with each one. He had a feeling in his gut, a discomfort that had only grown stronger since Clint had walked through the door. He didn't belong here. This wasn't a place for someone like him, no matter how famous or influential they were. That's when Emma, one of the waitresses, approached him. She had been serving Clint, and though she hadn't mentioned anything before, she now leaned in with a cautious whisper. "Isn't that guy a little too laid back for here?" Her tone was filled with uncertainty, echoing the feeling Jonathan couldn't shake. Jonathan narrowed his eyes and looked over at Clint again, his gaze more critical this time. The man was sitting back in his chair, reading the menu with an air of complete detachment. Clint didn't even look like he was in a rush. He wasn't glancing around for attention or making any noticeable effort to blend in with the well-heeled crowd. His presence was understated, almost too understated. Something about it made Jonathan uncomfortable, more so than he'd like to admit. Too casual. Too unrefined. He didn't belong in this world of pristine tablecloths, expensive wine glasses, and hushed conversations. Jonathan had worked hard to carve out a place for himself in this high-stakes environment, and anyone who disrupted that balance was a potential threat. "Keep an eye on him," Jonathan muttered to Emma, his nerves on edge. He quickly turned his attention back to the rest of the restaurant, trying to mask the unease creeping up his spine. His mind raced as he tried to put his discomfort aside. It wasn't just about Clint's appearance. Something felt off about this whole situation. There was no way he could let this get out of hand. If things continued the way they were, the night could slip out of his control faster than he could manage. Emma nodded and walked away, leaving Jonathan to his thoughts. He paced by the back hallway, unable to focus on anything else. There was no reason for him to overreact, right? It was just one guest. But the feeling in his gut kept gnawing at him, urging him to act before things went too far. Jonathan found himself glancing back at Clint again, the discomfort still gnawing at him. The longer Clint remained at that table, the more Jonathan's unease swelled. He knew that the next step was crucial. He needed to regain control, and if Clint wasn't going to fit into the mold Jonathan had set for the evening, well, something had to be done. After a few more minutes, Jonathan couldn't take it any longer. His patience had been worn thin, fraying with every tick of the clock. Enough was enough. This wasn't just any ordinary night at La Belle Époque. It was a night he had meticulously planned to perfection, and someone had to remind this diner of their place. He'd spent years managing this restaurant, pouring his soul into ensuring it ran like a well-oiled machine. The atmosphere, the crowd, the service, every detail had to align with the high standards he'd worked so hard to establish. And now, this man in a leather jacket, seated casually in the middle of it all, was a disruption to that balance. Jonathan's eyes narrowed as he pushed away from the back hallway. He walked straight toward Clint's table, his face set in a stern frown, his jaw clenched with determination. His pace quickened as the tension in the air thickened, the weight of his decision bearing down on him. "Excuse me, sir," Jonathan said, his voice clipped, authoritative, the kind of tone he reserved for those who needed to be put in their place. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Your attire doesn't meet our standards, and this isn't the sort of place for." Clint looked up at him, his expression unchanging, as if he had anticipated this moment. For a split second, there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but it quickly disappeared. Instead of anger or defensiveness, Clint's demeanor was calm, perhaps even a little bemused. "What do you mean, leave?" Clint asked, his voice smooth, barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying through the silence of the room. He raised an eyebrow, genuinely confused. "I'm just here for a meal." The question hung in the air, but Jonathan wasn't about to let it deflate the tension he had created. He had made up his mind, and no amount of calmness or confusion was going to stop him. "This is a fine dining establishment, not a pub," Jonathan replied, his words clipped and sharp. "I'm afraid you'll have to leave. We can't have people wandering around dressed like that. It's simply not appropriate." The words hit Clint like a brush of wind, unfazed, indifferent. But in the quiet that followed, the rest of the restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The murmurs of conversation fell into silence, and Jonathan could feel the eyes of the entire dining room trained on him. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, others stared at Jonathan in disbelief, unsure if they had witnessed what they thought they had. Clint's calm, composed demeanor seemed to make Jonathan's words feel even more harsh. The manager's authority, which had once seemed solid and justified, now felt out of place, like an unwelcome interruption in the otherwise serene flow of the evening. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, as the weight of the moment settled over the restaurant. Jonathan could feel his face growing warm, the realization starting to dawn on him. His harshness had been too sudden, too strong. He had judged a man based on appearance, assuming that the standard he had set would apply to everyone in the same way. And as Clint sat there, unfazed, an uncomfortable knot twisted in Jonathan's stomach. Was it possible that he had made a grave mistake? Clint stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. His calmness was so steady, it seemed almost unnerving. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even frustrated. There was a quiet strength in his demeanor that made him stand apart from everyone else in the room. His eyes locked with Jonathan's, unwavering, and for just a moment, Jonathan felt a pang of doubt, a flicker of uncertainty in his chest. It wasn't a look of challenge. It wasn't defiance. It was simply an expression of calm, a silent understanding that made Jonathan's earlier decision seem suddenly rash. The flicker of hesitation in Jonathan's mind was brief, but he quickly shook it off. He was in charge here, not Clint. This was his restaurant, and his rules were supposed to apply to everyone. "I don't want any trouble," Clint said softly, his voice measured and steady. "I just wanted a quiet meal." His words hung in the air, and for a split second, Jonathan felt the weight of them. It was almost as if Clint was offering him a chance to back down, to reassess the situation and avoid escalating things further. But Jonathan was too far gone. He had made his decision and there was no going back. He couldn't afford to show weakness now, not in front of the other diners. "I'm afraid you don't belong here," Jonathan repeated, his voice now louder, more forceful. The words felt final, like a door slamming shut, but there was something in the way Clint stood there, unmoved, that made the finality seem less certain. Clint hadn't shown any signs of anger or even irritation. He was just there, waiting. "Come." Around them the atmosphere began to shift. Whispers started to spread like wildfire across the room. Guests exchanged furtive glances, eyebrows raised, unsure of what they were witnessing. Some looked between Clint and Jonathan, sensing that something significant was unfolding right in front of them. Others leaned in, watching the confrontation with quiet fascination, but no one seemed willing to intervene. It was as if the whole restaurant had turned into a quiet spectator to a drama they hadn't expected. The normal hum of conversation had faded into the background, replaced by an uncomfortable tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Clint stood up from the table, his movements still slow and deliberate. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't making a scene. His exterior remained completely calm, and yet, in that calmness, there was something even more unnerving. There was no defensiveness, no fight in him. Just a quiet, unshakable resolve. With every step he took, it became clearer that the man wasn't about to argue. He wasn't going to escalate things into a confrontation. He was simply going to leave as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Jonathan stood frozen for a moment, watching Clint gather his things. His gut told him something wasn't right, but he couldn't put his finger on it. What had he missed? Why didn't Clint seem to care about being thrown out? And yet, even as Clint made his way toward the door, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake. The weight of his decision settled on him like a heavy stone, and the silence in the room was deafening. As Clint reached the door, the tension was almost unbearable. The entire restaurant was watching now, their eyes fixed on the exit, where the legend, who had been unceremoniously dismissed like any ordinary diner, was about to leave without a word of complaint. Jonathan stood there, his mind racing but his feet rooted to the floor. He had acted swiftly, but now it felt like the ground beneath him was crumbling. Just as Clint reached for the door, a voice from across the room broke the charged silence, shattering Jonathan's already fragile composure. "Isn't that Clint Eastwood?" someone whispered loudly, almost as if it were a challenge to the atmosphere that had been quietly building around them. The words hit Jonathan like a ton of bricks. His stomach lurched, and for a moment the room seemed to tilt. Clint Eastwood? It was as if time had frozen. His mind raced, scrambling to process the revelation. His gaze snapped back to Clint, who was now halfway to the door, his movements still slow, deliberate, unaffected. This wasn't just any ordinary diner. This wasn't some unremarkable guest dressed too casually for his restaurant. This was Clint Eastwood, the Hollywood icon, the man whose films had shaped the very genre of American cinema. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a disaster. The realization hit Jonathan like a slap to the face. He had just kicked out Clint Eastwood. The famous actor, one of the most recognizable figures in the world, had been standing right in front of him, and Jonathan had humiliated him. He had dismissed him without so much as a second thought. The rush of humiliation was instant and overwhelming. He froze, rooted to the spot. His face turned beet red and his breath caught in his throat. He could feel the heat rise in his cheeks, his heart racing. His mind was a whirlwind of disbelief. How could he have been so blind? How could he have not recognized him sooner? But it was too late now. The words were already out, the damage already done. He couldn't undo the humiliation he had caused. Clint, on the other hand, remained unfazed. He hadn't broken his stride for even a second. His face was calm, his posture unchanged, as if he were simply going about his day. There was no sign of anger or frustration, just the same composed, unbothered Clint Eastwood that had made him a legend. He kept walking toward the door, and Jonathan watched, frozen, as the man who had just been tossed out of his restaurant, the man who had been disrespected by him, continued without a hint of acknowledgement toward the scene he had just left behind. Clint Eastwood wasn't rattled by the situation. In fact, it almost seemed as if it were just another ordinary day for him, one where the unfortunate events that had just unfolded were nothing more than a blip in an otherwise long and storied career. Jonathan stood there, dumbfounded, the weight of the moment settling heavily in his chest. The tension in the room, once focused on the drama between the manager and the diner, now seemed to turn its attention back to Jonathan. He could feel the eyes of every patron on him, watching, judging. The realization of his mistake was now public, and the consequences of his rash decision were hanging in the air like an open wound. Clint was almost out the door now, his back turned, walking with that same calm indifference. He hadn't even bothered to turn around and address Jonathan, as if he'd simply decided to let the whole thing roll off his back. And in that moment, Jonathan realized just how foolish he had been. But there was no going back now. The room had witnessed it all, and he could do nothing but stand there, feeling the weight of his mistake. As Clint reached for the door, Jonathan's mind raced, his legs moving before he could fully think it through. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him, each second that passed deepening the pit in his stomach. The realization of what he had just done was suffocating. He couldn't let Clint walk out like this, not without trying to fix what was now so clearly broken. His heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled to catch up. "Wait. Mr. Eastwood, please," Jonathan called out, his voice flustered, thick with embarrassment. He reached out a hand as if somehow that would bridge the gap between his hasty decision and the apology he was desperate to give. "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize. Please let me make it up to you. A complimentary meal, a VIP table, anything you want, please." For a long moment, Clint didn't respond. He simply kept walking toward the door as if he hadn't heard a word. Jonathan's pulse quickened. This was his only chance. If Clint walked out now, there was no coming back from this. He couldn't let that happen. Finally, Clint paused, slowly turning around. He looked at Jonathan, his face a study of unshakable calm, not a hint of anger or frustration betraying his features. The look in his eyes was steady, too steady, and yet it held no malice. It was simply knowing. "You can keep your free meal," Clint replied, his voice smooth and measured, like a man who had already heard all the apologies the world had to offer. "But maybe next time, think twice before you judge a man by his jacket." The words hit Jonathan harder than he could have anticipated. There was no harshness in Clint's tone, no venom. But the weight of his words was enough to cut through Jonathan's already fragile pride. He hadn't just made a mistake, he had made a judgment based on something as superficial as appearance. And now, Clint was offering him a lesson in humility, one that would leave an imprint for a long time. Jonathan stood there, completely still, the weight of regret and humiliation washing over him like a tide. He had just made a colossal mistake and now there was no undoing it. The apology had come too late. The damage was done and Clint was already turning to leave, his composure intact. Jonathan could do nothing but watch as the legend he had so casually dismissed walked out the door, unaffected by the drama that had just unfolded. As Clint disappeared out into the night, Jonathan was left standing in the middle of the restaurant, his mind spinning with the realization of just how badly he had misjudged the situation. The tension in the room that had hung so thickly just moments before began to fade, but it wasn't replaced with relief. It was replaced with an overwhelming sense of inadequacy. The room was still full of people, but now they felt like distant spectators to his failure. Clint Eastwood had walked out, but the real lesson for Jonathan had only just begun. Just as Clint walked out the door, Jonathan thought he could finally breathe, thinking the worst of it was over. But then, to his shock, something unexpected happened. One lone diner in the corner stood up, a man who had been enjoying his meal in quiet observation, and started clapping. At first, it seemed like an isolated gesture, almost too subtle to make a difference. But then another diner joined in and another, until the entire room erupted into applause. The sound echoed off the walls, reverberating through the restaurant like a wave of collective realization. They all knew who Clint was. The legendary actor, the icon, the man who had been disrespected in front of them all, and now they were acknowledging him with their applause, not out of mockery, but as a sign of respect for the way he had handled the entire ordeal. They couldn't believe what had just happened. Jonathan stood frozen in the middle of the room, his face burning with embarrassment. He felt the weight of their eyes on him, the slow realization that the entire restaurant had just turned against him, even if they hadn't said a word directly. The clapping wasn't for him, it was for Clint, who had walked out with unflinching dignity, never losing his composure for a second. Jonathan stood there, powerless, as the applause continued, mocking him without ever uttering a single word. His face flushed crimson as he absorbed the full gravity of the situation. The very guests he had worked so hard to please, the ones he had catered to with every ounce of his effort, were now laughing at him. They were not laughing with him, they were laughing at him. In their eyes, he had become the joke of the evening. Clint's cool exit only made it worse for Jonathan. His graceful departure, without a single word of confrontation or anger, only served to highlight how poorly Jonathan had handled the situation. Clint had left, and now it was Jonathan who remained, standing in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. Every lingering guest was an unspoken reminder of his mistake. Jonathan knew, deep down, that his blunder had just cost him the respect of every customer in the room. They had witnessed firsthand how he had treated one of the most respected figures in Hollywood, and now they were reacting in the only way they knew how, by showing their support for Clint, the man Jonathan had so carelessly dismissed. The clapping began to die down, but the sting of their silent judgment lingered in the air. Jonathan knew it was going to be a long time before he could look any of these patrons in the eye again. And worse, he knew that the story of this night, the night when the manager of La Belle Époque had kicked out Clint Eastwood, would be one that would echo far beyond the walls of the restaurant. Later that night, after the restaurant had quieted down and the last few customers had left, Jonathan sat alone in his office, the lights dimmed low. The hum of the city outside seemed distant, almost muffled, as if the world had moved on without him. He leaned back in his chair, his mind still replaying the events of the evening, but it was no use. The humiliation was inescapable. His hand hovered over the keyboard as he replayed the security footage, a silent witness to his failure. He watched it all unfold again. The moment Clint had walked in, the way Jonathan had brushed him off, the arrogance in his tone when he ordered Clint to leave, and finally, the public applause that followed Clint's departure. The footage didn't lie. It was all there, every cringeworthy second of it. Jonathan's face sank as he watched himself, someone who had worked tirelessly his whole life to build a reputation, to create an atmosphere of excellence and prestige, make a fool of himself in front of an entire room full of people. He had humiliated a legend, a man whose career had spanned decades, whose impact had been felt worldwide. And for what? To uphold an image of sophistication that had now proven to be as fragile and shallow as the wine glasses on his tables? The realization hit him hard, sharper than any critic's review, harsher than any complaint from a dissatisfied guest. He had made a judgment about Clint based purely on appearances. He had assumed that Clint's casual demeanor, his lack of a tailored suit, his worn-in leather jacket, meant he didn't belong in his restaurant. But in the end, it was Jonathan who didn't belong. It was his assumption that had led him astray, not Clint's attire. Jonathan sighed deeply, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him like an anchor. It was clear now that the most important lesson of the night wasn't about how he had treated Clint Eastwood. No, the real lesson was in how he treated people in general. He had allowed his obsession with appearances, with maintaining a certain image, to cloud his judgment. He had equated worth with outward appearance, not realizing that the true value of a person lies far beyond what they wear or how they present themselves. The restaurant, with all its luxury and elegance, had been a symbol of Jonathan's pursuit of perfection. But that pursuit had blinded him to the most fundamental truth of hospitality. It wasn't about the suits and the crystal glasses or the polished floors. It was about respect, kindness, and seeing people for who they truly were, not just what they looked like on the outside. Jonathan sat there in the quiet of his office, the hum of the city still distant, and for the first time that night he felt something else: humility. The kind of humility that couldn't be taught in any training manual or seminar, but only learned through the hard, painful way. He had let his ego run the show, and now that ego was lying in pieces on the floor. As he sat there, staring at the screen, Jonathan made a silent promise to himself. The next time he interacted with a guest, whether it was Clint Eastwood or anyone else, He would do so with the understanding that appearances were nothing compared to the dignity and respect everyone deserved. He knew it was a lesson he'd never forget and hopefully, one that would shape the kind of manager he would become. As the story came to an end, Clint Eastwood, miles away from La Belle Époque, was likely already forgetting about the ordeal. For him, it was just another incident in a life full of them. A brief moment in time that would soon fade into the background of his storied career. He had long since turned the page on that chapter. For Clint, the evening had been nothing more than a passing flicker, an interruption he had handled with the same cool, unflappable demeanor that had made him a legend. But for Jonathan, the lesson was far from over. He couldn't undo what had happened, no matter how much he wished he could. The events of that night were etched into his memory, a reminder of how quickly one can lose their way when they forget what truly matters. The taste of humiliation was still fresh, but there was something else now, something deeper, a resolve to never make the same mistake again. Jonathan knew that from now on, he would treat everyone who walked through his doors with the respect they deserved. It didn't matter who they were, or how they dressed, or where they came from. He had learned the hard way that true value couldn't be measured by outward appearances. It was in how one treated others, in the way they carried themselves, and the integrity they showed when no one was watching. From that moment on, he would make sure every guest, whether a famous actor or a regular patron, felt valued the same way. And somewhere out there, Clint Eastwood might have smiled to himself, the faintest hint of a knowing grin tugging at the corner of his lips. He was a man who had seen it all, who had been through his own share of challenges and triumphs. He didn't need to make a scene or say anything to make Jonathan feel his mistake. He simply knew that sometimes, the most valuable lessons come in the most unexpected ways. The real legend wasn't the man in the leather jacket. It was the lesson that had been learned, not through words but through actions. As Clint moved on, so did Jonathan. And though their paths had crossed only briefly, that encounter would shape him forever.